Okay.
To take the introduction.
Yes, I do.
Can I have your attention, please?
Yes, it's working.
Welcome and thank you for being here at the Branson Centennial Museum for our first Tuesday talk of 2024. January weather was a little iffy, so we decided it'd be better and safer to have Curtis on a beautiful day in February. We ordered this special for you. Just want to let you all know, many of you I think are regulars to our Tuesday talks. We do these free of charge to create more awareness for the Branson Centennial Museum that has existed here for going on 12 years. At this location, not quite as long, but we have this beautiful facility thanks to the generosity of Joe Reish and his family, who owned and operated their shoe store here for many, many years. The museum survives on donations and volunteers. So you know what that means for all of you. If you enjoy the museum and you enjoy these talks, please consider dropping something in the box when you leave and telling your friends and family to come and check out the museum and join us for one of these Tuesday talks too. We're still in the process of planning March, so I can't give you a sneak preview to what the next months will offer yet, but watch your emails and watch us on Facebook to learn more about what the upcoming schedule is. Also wanted today to introduce you to the new manager/curator of the Branson Centennial Museum. This is Terry Vacanti. Vacanti, almost got that right. You will see her here often, taking care of all of the workings of this fine little local museum that we have that celebrates what a great and amazing town Branson, Missouri is. But today, a special treat. Curtis Copeland works full-time for the city of Branson, and his other full-time job is expert historian for the Ozarks. Recently, he went to Washington, D.C. as part of the Smithsonian tribute to the Ozarks. He's founded and still probably running the Ozark Hillcrofters Association, and is also a talented map maker, and that's what he does with the city. So we're thrilled to have him here as the author of the book, Mildred
Quit Hollering.
Quit Hollering. I don't know about you, but I'm dying to know what Mildred was hollering about. And he's collected these stories, and he will tell you all about them in fun fashion, as he always does. So, ladies and gentlemen, Curtis Copeland.
Well, thank you, Ann, so much for the nice introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm going to try to go without a microphone today. But so the Mildred Quit Hollering is a brand new book. It's only been out about 3 months, not even 3. It officially came out in December. And so what it is, it's a compilation of Vance Randolph stories that had been lost for about 40 years. And then also it has quite a bit of research on Randolph's informants, which are the storytellers that gave him these stories. And then there's another element with some contemporary, very humorous Ozarks folk stories as well. But I think the best thing to do, is anybody here not familiar with Vance Randolph? Well, good, because we're going to go on a little bit of a deep dive. What's important about Mildred Quit Hollering, it's probably going to be unlike any book that you've read before, especially about the Ozarks. I mean, there's a lot of Vance Randolph folklore books, but there's also more of the academic element, I guess, if you will, with a lot of biographical information and history about his informants. And then there's the fictional part with the crazy stories of more contemporary Ozark stories, if you will. So the first thing we'll do today, we're going to find out who was Vance Randolph. And then we're going to learn a little bit about the backstory of Mildred Quit Hollering. And we're going to learn a little bit about Vance Randolph's informants that are included in the book. And then I'll tell you all there's a way to read this book. So who is Vance Randolph? And I get a lot of this information. It's a chronology of his life. And it was put together by Mike Luster. Now, Mike Luster is a folklorist and still around, but he was a grad student back in the late 1970s, and he spent countless hours in the nursing home room with Vance Randolph, learning all about Vance and his life story, because Michael Luster's professor was Dr. Bob Cochran. And so about 5 years after Vance Randolph's death, Cochran took Mike Luster's notes and put them together into a book called An Ozarks Life, which is the biography of Vance Randolph. So I'm working a lot with Mike Luster's notes. So Vance Randolph was from Off. He was born in Pittsburg, Kansas. From Off is Ozarks talk from not a local or not native. His parents were pretty high standing in the community. His father was a city attorney and his mother was the city librarian. And so that's probably where Vance got his interest in books. And then his first visit he was about 7 years old, and they went to, the family took a trip to Knoll, Missouri. Are y'all familiar with Knoll? It's down in southwest part of the state, along the Elk River. And I apologize, those of you in back probably can't see this, but when they visited back in 1899, it was the OJ Club, the Ojo Club, which was there at Knoll. Later on, it became known as the Shadow Lake Resort. But that's where it had such an impact, even at 7 years old, Vance had fallen in love with the Ozarks. So he was an educated man. He started off with actually got a BS in education from what's now known as Pittsburg State University. He thought he was going for a BA, or back then called an AB, and so he kind of pitched a fit, and he ended up getting both the diplomas, both the BS and the BA. Later on in 1915, he went on to get his master's in psychology at Clark University in Massachusetts, and he spent some time in Greenwich Village in New York as an editor and ghostwriter for Vanguard Press. So some of the things that are starting to come together for Randolph is his writing, his editing, also that he was into some scientific study, which he would later apply to his folklore collection. And also that he's working for Vanguard Press. So Vanguard Press back then was known as more of a socialist publication or publisher. So later on, World War I comes around, and Vance is drafted to go. He goes and does basic training in Camp Funston, Kansas, and then he went in as infantry and then switched to artillery. But before he could see any action, he was moved to he had some health issues and was moved to a hospital in Camp Pike, Arkansas. So he was discharged in December of 1918, and he did have a brother that did fight and lose his life in the Argonne. And then in 1924, kind of back to this writing, he's writing for Haldeman Julius out of Girard, Kansas, which isn't far from his hometown of Pittsburgh. Now, any of y'all remember little blue books? They have just little tiny paperback books, get them for about a nickel a piece, on every subject imaginable, from language to all different kind of sciences. And so Vance wrote many little blue books on many different topics. And a lot of these topics he would write under a pseudonym because they're of the more edgier flavor, if you will. So this is another part of his personality that we're learning about Vance. Again, Haldeman Julius was definitely known as a socialist publication at that time. Obviously, politics and things change over the past century, but the reason for that, as I mentioned earlier, he came from a prominent parents, but Pittsburg, Kansas was in the mining district, the Tri-States mining district of Southwest Missouri, northeast Oklahoma and southwest Kansas, or southeastern Kansas. And so there was a lot of miners in this area, mainly lead mining and zinc, some zinc. And they were from all over the world, people, Hungarians and different European peoples, and they were what he called the common folk. And he really felt like he could associate, he loved to hear their stories, but he was also really concerned and had a great concern for their working conditions, because they were just awful. I mean, being in those lead mines was terribly dangerous. And so he found a place in his heart for the common folk, and he says that's why he kind of leaned towards those socialist aspects. So finally, by 1920, he comes back to his beloved Ozarks. He goes to Pineville, which is just up the river, up Elk River from Knoll. So he remembered the area. Pineville, Missouri is, the county seat of McDonald County. And he bought a cabin from this gentleman here. It's Ed Wall. And Ed Wall was an interesting person. He was an old Ozarks hillman from McDonald County, and he provided Randolph with some of the first stories, the first folklore that he ever collected. Not only did Vance buy a cabin from Ed Wall, but he also bought a bunch of beehives and thought he would go into the beehive business. Well, that didn't last too long.
Done.
Right. So a few years later, another kind of pattern. So Vance, just to jump ahead a little bit, he never was quote unquote financially successful. And so with his, fortunate for him, he got the early discharge out of the Army, but he relied heavily on that income. But also, his first marriage was to Marie Wardlaw Wilbur of Pineville, who was, her father was a prominent doctor, prominent family, and for a little bitty tiny town like Pineville, they were kind of the upper class, if you will. She was several years older than Vance, and they had a home on Big Sugar Creek, and she most likely helped him along so that he could spend his time writing and collecting folklore and folk tales. So, jumping to 1931 is his first big break. It came out with a book called The Ozarks, An American Survival of Primitive Culture, and this had a major impact across the nation. So Vance knew what he was doing. He knew that folks from off, or people from the urban areas, they found the hillbillies and the hill folks to be quite interesting, and he really kind of dialed into that. And the Ozarks book was a huge success, and it led to a lot of other authors of that time period making both fiction and nonfiction books. None of them quite as successful as Vance, but it definitely started a phenomenon. It's where we really start to get, they reinvigorated that hillbilly image. So also, not only in books, but also in movies and radio shows and so forth. But to kind of show you what Vance had been doing over his career in perpetuating this romantic view of the Ozarks hillbilly, I'd like to introduce Mrs. Jewel Lamberson. And see if my little pointer works there. Not so well on the screen. But in the center, she's there in the center picture. And I'll describe to you all that may not be able to see in the back, but she's wearing the slat bonnet. She's barefoot. She's grinding some corn into a bucket. And she's out on a dirt path in the hills of the Ozarks. Well, so that was one of Vance's photos, an example of the hill folk for his Ozarks book. Well, Mrs. Jewel Lamberson was married to the editor of a prominent newspaper in McDonald County, a couple of them, and they were townsfolk. This is not what she wore. And then the next picture over, it shows Jewel riding on the back of a horse behind another one of Vance Randolph's informants by the name of Albert Price. And for those of you who can't see it, they're both on horseback and they're going into this creek. And in Vance's handwriting, this is out of the Ozarkiana collection over at the College of the Ozarks, which, plug for the Hillcrofters, we host those scanned images on our website. But she's on the back of the horse and she's got her skirt hiked way up high and you can see her long leg dangling there. And it says, Albert Pike and Mrs. Lamberson, we're trying to put a little sex into the hillbilly story. So Vance, you're starting to see he's a little bit of a character here. So 1932, follow along with the success of the Ozarks book. He follows up with Ozark Mountain Folks, which just is another volume of the same type of material. But what he'd been doing for the last nearly a decade, he'd been going out and collecting these Ozark folk tales, superstitions, ghost stories, folk remedies, folk songs. And Vance was a nonconformist. We're finding that out here pretty quick. And so he would go out and find the folks that were living in the most primitive fashion possible. Did that necessarily mean that was a good resemblance of the hill folks? Not necessarily, but he was looking for what fit his idea of the hill people, and again driving that romantic view of the Ozarks hillbilly that he felt was dying away as better transportation, communication, and a lot more people moved to the hills or visiting the hills. So again, not only that, also in 1932, he borrowed a covered wagon from a friend of his in Cyclone, Missouri, which is a little bitty dot on the map in McDonald County, and he was going to take a ride in a covered wagon from Pineville all the way to Little Rock, just so he could feel what it was like for the old pioneer Ozarkers. And again, another example of Vance Randolph humor. So in the upper right-hand corner of this picture, he says, "For Lillian, I'm the one on the left." So for those of you that can't see in the back, he's sitting on the buckboard of the wagon, and all you can see of the horse is it's behind. So. All right, so in 1933, he comes out with From an Ozarks Holler, which is first, it's kind of a mixture of fiction and nonfiction, so he's taken a lot of the folk beliefs and folk ways, but associating them with fictitious town and fictitious characters. So it's kind of a mixture there. I'm still trying to ride the wave of success on those Ozarks hillbilly stories. Interesting about this is that he dedicated this book to Agnes, Mabel, and Becky. So who are Agnes, Mabel, and Becky? Does anybody have any idea?
Children?
No? So back in the 1920s, there was a product called the Three Merry Widows named Agnes, Mabel, and Becky. And they were used for, safe procreation. They were... all right. So in 1934, the camp on Wildcat Creek came out, and so did Ozarks Outdoors. Ozarks Outdoors, again, instead of the folk ways and folk life, this was more heavily on hunting and fishing. So, and then in 1935, he tried to come out with a fully fictitious book called Hedwig, and it just wasn't his forte. It didn't do very well. All right, so 1940, an Ozark Anthology came out, which was a really neat book if you can get a hold of it. It's a bunch of stories by a bunch of well-known authors, some of them not as well-known, but a lot of them are of local interest. Thomas Hart Benton, who I didn't even realize was an author. I knew he was one of my favorite painters, but he's actually got a story in there, as does Rose O'Neill. And so it's a great book, and it's really nice because you can read a little short story and move away from it and come back to it. But also in 1941, Rose O'Neill invites him to work on her autobiography. So this is really interesting. And this raised a lot of, Branson area is a small town, especially back in the 40s, right? So it raised a lot of suspicion. Mary Wilbur his first wife had died about 8 or so years before. So he was a bachelor. And but Rose was several years older than him, but that didn't really mean anything. And if you look at another collection at the Ozarkiana Room are letters from the Vance Randolph collection from Rose O'Neill, and they're just beautiful. I mean, her handwriting was amazing. She illustrated every letter she ever wrote. But man, the language in that is really makes you wonder. So there's two schools of thought, one that was romantic, one that was platonic, and we may never know. But what we do know is that she was working on her autobiography about her life, and she had a sister named Callista. And Rose was a free spirit, and she was a wonderful artist, and she did wonderful things for her community in Day. Bonnie Brook is still there up in Day. She employed a lot of folks as housekeepers, people to work on the property. She was just wonderful. She'd hold parties for her neighbors. They all thought she was wonderful. She definitely didn't behave or act like one of them, but they all loved her just the same. And towards this time of her life, she was such a generous person. She's extremely successful as an illustrator, and at one point she was a millionaire. She had a mansion in Connecticut. She had a mansion at the Isle of Capri. But this time she was destitute financially because she was so generous. She had given the majority of her fortune away. The Bonnie Brook mansion was starting to fall apart, but she was writing her autobiography, and Vance was going to help her out. Well, Callista, thinking that she would protect her sister, started redacting a lot of it, started taking a lot of it out. And that really upset Vance. He's like, nope, I'm just frustrated with this. People want to hear your true story. There's nothing to be ashamed of. And so he gave up on it, unfortunately, because he's just frustrated that Callista wouldn't let her tell her whole story. 1941 and 1943, Vance Randolph got asked by Alan Lomax, a famous folklore collector from nationally known, to assist in collecting folk songs for the Library of Congress. So Vance got to borrow some equipment from the Library of Congress, this great big heavy machine that would record music and folk songs onto an aluminum disc. And those recordings are still at the Library of Congress. You can still listen to a few of them online, digitized, and they're really fun. This is a pretty famous picture. It was taken by Townsend Godsey. Have y'all ever heard of Townsend Godsey? Yeah. Great photographer, also an author himself. But on the far left, you see Deacon Frank Hembry playing the fiddle. He is also an informant for Vance Randolph and Mildred Quit Hollering. And he was a number of things. One of them was he was a river guide on the James River, much like the Jim Owen float trips on the White River. Deacon Frank Hembry was one of the favorite guides because he told some of the best stories. 1946, this is probably one of Vance's most famous and most massive works. He did a four-volume set of Ozarks folk songs, literally hundreds of collected folk songs. He got the words and lyrics and notes, background on the stories, annotations. A lot of the folk songs we have in the Ozarks are hundreds of years old and come from the British Isles and other places in Europe. They're just brought over here. So Vance was able to annotate information about all of that. So in 1947, Ozark Superstitions came out. Probably more popular today, even than it was back then. It's now known as Ozarks Magic and Folklore, and it's still in print. I've gotten a number of copies over the years that have worn out, one from Silver Dollar City, one from Barnes & Noble in Springfield, and wherever else. but it's hugely popular to this day. And it's led to even more studies. There's a guy down out of northwest Arkansas named Brandon Weston who makes Ozark magic, or writes books about Ozark's magic and Ozark spells, and he uses some of Vance's research for those. 1951, we start to get into a period where Vance has a lot of books coming out from the press. The first of those two is We Always Lie to Strangers. So that's become kind of a one of our mottos here in Branson, right? We always lie to strangers. So Vance had come up with that years ago, back in the 50s, and then the other one was Who Blew Up the Church House. But another thing that was important that happened in 1951 is, so Vance never had a degree. He never had the letters behind his name as a folklorist, an academic, if you will. And he was never really recognized by the academic, the academia at all. And he had spent his life collecting folklore. I mean, from an anthropology standpoint, or music standpoint, history standpoint, he'd done massive amount of work. But finally, in 1951, he got an honorary doctorate from the University of Arkansas. So in 1953, Down in the Holler comes out. It's a gallery of Ozark folk speech. Many of you may have heard of it. Some of you may not have heard of it directly, but have experienced it indirectly, because it's a whole dictionary of Ozark sayings and Ozarks talk and dialect. And it's amazing for every subject and topic. But also in 1954, another key component I want to tell you all about. He deposited all his unprintable material, all the stories, unprintable stories and songs that he collected. Those manuscripts he sent to the Kinsey Institute in Indiana. Those of you who don't know who Kinsey is, do a quick Google search. But you'll understand what the subject matter was. And then also he sent a copy to the Library of Congress and a couple other universities. And the reason he sent them to these places is because his publishers wouldn't touch it. So it's he went out into the hills and was collecting everything from, the superstitions, the old folk songs, what they were cooking, how they cooked it, hunting, everything. But he was also collecting, they would tell dirty stories and jokes. And his publishers in the 1950s wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. But he knew that there was some importance to it, because we're all humans. We all have different aspects about us. He felt it was an important study. Again, this is a continuation of his books in the 50s. We got The Devil's Pretty Daughter and Other Ozarks Folktales, The Talking Turtle, and Sticks in the Knapsack. All these are a lot of fun and excellent reading if you can get a hold of them. So in 1960, he moves to Fayetteville, mainly because he marries longtime friend Mary Celestia Parler. So by this time, Vance was 70. Mary Parler was a very important folklore collector herself. She was from that academic side. She was a professor at University of Arkansas in folklore studies, and she would employ her students, which were all from the Ozarks of Arkansas, to go out into the hills and collect stories for her collection. So those are available online as well. They're a lot of fun. I'm getting close here. I'm almost done talking about Vance. Thanks for bearing with me. 1965, we're starting to wind down here. His last two books that he worked on mostly by himself was Hot Springs in Hell, and then Ozark Folklore, annotated bibliography. So Ozark Folklore bibliography is important because he went through what he thought was every book about the Ozarks, every magazine, every publication he could get his hands on, and annotated what was important about that story for future study of the Ozarks. So by this time, he's 80 years old, and he's into the nursing home in Fayetteville. And this is kind of the watershed moment of his life. No pun intended, or maybe pun intended. But in 1976, the University of Illinois got a hold of a lot of that unprintable material and produced a book, the title story coming from Deacon Frank Hembry, Pissing in the Snow and Other Ozarks Folktales. So Vance, in the nursing home at this time, found this was his greatest selling book by far. All his books combined did not outsell this book. And it is still in print, and it's still selling big time. So I don't know if this necessarily has anything in common, but that same year on June 12th, Governor David Pryor proclaims June 12th Vance Randolph Day. So thank you, Pissing in the Snow. And more accolades. He finally, in 1978, just 2 years before his death, was recognized by the academic folklorist he'd spent his whole life to try to impress, but they finally elected him a fellow in the American Folklore Society. So that's Vance Randolph. That gives you a good idea of what we're dealing with Mildred Quit Hollering. So, what is the backstory of Mildred Quit Hollering? Okay, in the center of this picture, does anybody know Gordon? Okay, this is the interesting part. In his own right, is very much like a Randolph, and he is an Ozarks fiddle music expert. He spent, probably 40 years collecting thousands of Ozarks fiddle tunes all over the Ozarks, recording them. And he's a great Ozarks historian in his own right. He had one of the biggest Ozarks libraries of books I've ever seen in private collection of his own, and just a really treasured for our area for knowledge about the Ozarks. But the most interesting thing about Gordon as relates to Mildred is that back when Vance Randolph was in the nursing home in the 1970s, Gordon was also from a young age interested in Ozarks history. He's like, I really got to meet Vance Randolph. So he goes down there to Fayetteville. Gordon had a couple kids going to U of A, and he also had a Springfield Blueprint Company. So he had a number of clients that were down in the Fayetteville, Northwest Arkansas area. So he had plenty of excuses to go down and into Fayetteville. He stopped by and met Vance, and Vance and him immediately hit it off. And so Gordon told Vance, you're annotated bibliography of the Ozarks. There's a lot more books out there. And Vance is like, no way. No, there's no way I covered it all. He goes, no, believe me. So Gordon went out to all the libraries all over southwest Missouri and northwest Arkansas, all the used bookstores, and he would find these other books, and he would bring them back to the nursing home, and him and Vance would work through them together. So for several years, they worked together like that. And then Gordon went ahead and finished the second volume after Vance Randolph had died. The second volume of the Ozarks Folklore Annotated Bibliography came out in the mid-'80s. So, similar to Gordon being interested in Vance Randolph, a few years back I was very interested in Vance and Gordon, so I made it a point to meet with Gordon one time. And I was similar to Vance and similar to Gordon back in the 70s. Gordon was in his 40s, Vance was in his 80s, pushing 90. I was in my 40s at the time, and Gordon was in his late 80s, and so it's kind of a special thing I felt. But I tell you, Gordon McCann put me through the test. So for the first 6 or 7 visits, Gordon wanted to know who and what I knew about the Ozarks before he would 100% be my friend and 100% really open up. But I guess I passed the test because we're still good friends. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, Gordon says, "Hey Curtis, I got something for you," and he pulls out this manuscript. It was an old typewritten manuscript, and he said this was what Vance was working on. He wanted to do a follow-up to Pitts, and that's what they called pissing in the snow. And he said he died before it was finished. He says, "Here, take it, do what you want with it, see if you can do something with it." So it only had 42 stories at that time. The book that you'll see today has 38, because even the publisher, Acclaimed Press, said there's about 3 of these bitches. And so what I did for the next 3 years was, what I always thought was fascinating was to learn about these informants, because they're all different types of people. What I've learned, my paradigm was that Vance Randolph would go back in the hills and find some old cabin, but that was only about 50% of the time. He collects stories from the town folk and everything. But as far as the body stories, like in Pitts, he was getting them from men, women, all ages, all walks of life. It was like, man, everybody's got kind of that fun side, don't they? But so I wanted to know about these people. So as I researched these informants, I found out that a lot of times the informant stories were amazing, and you'll find that out in this book as well. And I think Ann posed the question, is the story behind Mildred Quit Hollering. And the deal is Vance, let me relate it like this. So a few people would visit Vance in the nursing home, and Mike Lester, I'd heard about this manuscript before I even saw it. He said, yeah, he loved to torment the nurses with the title of his new book he was coming out with. And I can't say it here in mixed company, but what I will say is Mildred Quit Hollering was his second choice. You can find out about the first choice in the book. So how am I doing on time? Anybody know? How many?
105.
Okay, well, give me just a couple more minutes. I'll just a couple of informants. This isn't all of them in the book, but here's a sampling. This is George Bays. He's one of the best fiddle players in Stone County back in the day. He would play fiddle on the front porch of Old Mac's cabin, along with the original Fiddlin' Jake, Mr. Charles Vining. Yeah. Question on that? Okay. All right. Another one is Otto Rayburn. He was a big-time Ozarks Boosterism magazine publisher. Again, a guy who never was really financially successful with it, but his best-known publication was called the Ozarks Guide, and some of you may have seen that. Very good friend with Vance Randolph. Otto lived in Eureka Springs, and Vance said that Otto had the best Ozarks library, better than any university around at that time. So that's why he spent a lot of time in Eureka together. May Kendi McCord. Anybody heard of May? Yeah. Queen of the Hillbillies, yeah. She had a newspaper column called Hillbilly Heartbeats in Springfield, extremely successful. She was a Galena girl, and she wrote about the old times in the Ozarks. And then she was so popular, she got a radio show, and people just loved listening to her tell the old stories. But she was also one of Vance Randolph's biggest defendants. A defender of Vance. Real quick story, super quick. There's a guy named John Woodruff who was a very successful businessman in Springfield. I mean, he's left his mark on Springfield, the Woodruff Building. He was instrumental in bringing Route 66 through Springfield back in the day. So he was big on saying, hey, the Ozarks is a great place to do business. I want to bring businesses here. We're not a bunch of backwards hillbillies. So there was a meeting when he was the president of the Chamber of Commerce in Springfield, and he invited Vance because they were getting ready to have the very first folk festival back in the 30s. And Vance is sitting there, and so is May McCord, luckily. And John T. Woodruff says, these authors like Thames Williamson, who wrote that nasty Woods Colt, and Harold Bell Wright, and Vance Randolph, these guys don't know a dadgum thing about the Ozarks. They make us all look like a bunch of dumb hillbillies. And Vance, usually he's kind of the witty guy, but he's just so flabbergasted. Well, he crossed the wrong lady because May Kennedy McCord defended and made John have to reel his words back in the newspaper of Springfield. I'll just do one more. Uncle Jack Short of Galena. He's got a story in the book. So he had multiple sons, but two of them were pretty famous. Y'all ever hear of Dewey Short? Yeah. Representative, very instrumental in our Table Rock Lake and a number of other things. But also there was another son, his brother Leonard Shock Short, who was a bank robber. And he eventually got killed in a bank robbery gone bad. Vance always said that he liked Shock a lot better than he did Dewey. And then Fred High, he had his own town and his own post office in Arkansas, but I know I'm running along here. So real quick, how to read Mildred. Let me read you a couple things here, because just real quick, some things I want you all to keep in mind when you read it. So, it's a preservation of Randolph's personality, nonconformist, ornery, satirical, love of the Ozarks and Ozarkers, lamenting the loss of the romanticized hillfolk and hillbilly. Although Randolph was the greatest collector of Ozarks folklore and folk songs, he was also sometimes a rounder and a drinker, almost Hemingway-esque. He liked pretty girls, guns, cigars, and scotch. Ultimately, Randolph gained the respect of the academic folklorist community, and he gained the moniker of Mr. Ozark. So, and this is the last thing I'll leave you with, is in regards to Mildred, there's a good amount of BS. But like cholesterol, there's good BS and bad BS. And Augustus Finch, he does his best to explain the difference. So, thank you all very much. Y'all have any questions? Yes.
You gave us about at least 20 books that Vance Randolph wrote.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us maybe like your top 2 or 3 picks for us to research and read and so forth? Is there like what a person if a person only had to read 2 or 3 books of Vance Randolph, what should they read?
Okay, well, start with Mildred Quit Hollering.
Okay.
and then
repeat the question, would you so?
Oh yeah, his question was there's Vance wrote several books. What would be the recommended readings? And I suggest obviously start with Mildred. But so his first one, the Ozarks, the Survival of Primitive Society. That's been reprinted by the University of Arkansas Press, so it's easily available and it's a great book. There's so many folklore books, but probably one of my favorite ones is Sticks in the Knapsack, if you can get a hold of it. That's a great one. And then once you got to warm up with Mildred, then you'll probably be calloused enough that you can go ahead and get Pitts. All right, and
it is cheap on eBay. You can get it for $5.
Oh yeah, Pitts you can get pretty cheap. There's a lot of them out there, isn't there?
How difficult is it to come up with the 4 books that are the music of the Ozarks?
It's difficult now. Roger Fortner, I'll introduce you to him. He's a guy he's been my go-to guy to get rare Ozarks books over the years. And one of the quests that we've been working on is getting a full set of those, and it's difficult.
Yeah.
But that's if you're into music, there's especially Ozarks music. There's that's definitely the go-to source.
Some libraries have that set.
Yeah,
Yeah.
library.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Anyone else? Okay. Well, I appreciate y'all letting me be here. I'll stick around and sign some books if you want me to. So.
That was fun.
Thank you.